Chapter 5. Though I was exhausted, sleep did not come easily. I tossed and turned the whole night. Several times I came close to drifting off, only to be jerked awake by the rocking of the ship or the sound of a wave hitting the side. Incessant reminders of where I was and the precarious situation in which I found myself. My stomach churned as I laid awake and stared at the ceiling. Even given the current arrangement, I still had plenty of anxieties about what was to come. Convincing Father not to bring the hammer down on my abductors was going to be a challenge, and even if I managed to get out of this ordeal alive, I was certain that I would never be allowed out of the house again. The only reason Father had agreed to let me go on this voyage was because Mother had insisted that I visit her in Calais. He'd use this incident as an excuse to prevent me from setting foot on a ship ever again. I was certain. When I eventually closed my eyes, I was greeted by an endless barrage of nightmares. I wasn't sure which were worse. The ones where I was being thrown over the side of the ship and left to drown, or the ones where my father locked me in my bedroom for years on end before forcing me to marry some older man with a large wad of money. I woke the next morning to a sharp knock on the door. Feeling sick to my stomach, I pulled myself out of bed and went to open it, only to find a small tray with some hard bread and fruit preserves sitting on the floor just outside. I brought the food into the room and tried my best to nibble on it, thinking it might help settle the butterflies in my stomach. Part of me wanted to simply curl up and go back to sleep, in the hopes that when I awoke, I would be back in my own bed in southern England. But I knew better than to set myself up for a disappointment like that. Besides, I was just too restless. I glanced out the small porthole over the bed, longing for a breath of fresh air, but Grayson's warning last night kept ringing in my ears. I scowled at myself, jaw clenching. I was almost certain that he had said those things for no other reason than to frighten me. But even more annoying was the fact that it had worked. Regardless, I convinced myself that it would do me good to step outside for a few minutes. The area below deck reeked of rotting wood and growing mold, and while it had been bearable at first, it was starting to get to me, and certainly not helping my upset stomach. I opened the door and actively decided not to seek out Grayson. He would, I felt, only ruin my morning further. Perhaps I was trying to regain some control over my situation, or it was simply petty spite. But the thought of finding him just so he could follow me all over the ship put an uncomfortable tension in my chest. I made my way down the hallway towards the stairs, catching a whiff of the salty air travelling down from up above. I had never been particularly fond of the smell, but it was better than the inescapable stench that filled the space below. I climbed the staircase and squinted against the glaring sunlight as I emerged on deck, almost immediately feeling several pairs of eyes turn on me. Suddenly remembering how I looked, my cheeks began to burn. I clutched at the ruffles on the sides of the unseemly dress. I was not unused to being stared at like this. Back home, I'd often gotten looks and whispers from my father's men. As the unmarried 22-year-old daughter of Admiral Williams himself, any outing I made was something of a spectacle, whether I intended for it to be or not. But this was much different. I'd had the luxury of knowing that my father's men would never dare lay a hand on me. Save the ones I allowed, of course. What my father didn't know wouldn't hurt him. But here, eyes were drawn to me for different reasons altogether, and no matter how hard I tried to put it out of my mind, I kept hearing Grayson's words playing over and over again in my ears. Tendrils of regret started creeping their way into my head, but I was far too proud to turn around and go back down the stairs, not with everyone watching my every move. I swallowed and lifted my chin, crossing my arms awkwardly over my chest and looking for somewhere to go. My eyes landed on the railing and locked on, trying to ignore the stares of the pirates on deck as they whispered amongst themselves. As I reached the edge of the deck, I focused instead on the blue waves on the horizon, which stretched for miles upon miles ahead of me. Though the rocking of the ship was nauseating from below deck, it was somehow comforting to watch the water roll lazily back and forth from up here. I heard voices to my lower left and peered further over the side of the ship to look down. Much to my surprise, there were 2 men on the hull. They seemed at first to be floating over the water, but I quickly realized that they were actually being suspended by a complicated system of ropes secured around their waists. Curious, I followed the trail to another man on deck just a short way from me. He stood near some kind of pulley, which supported the weight of the 2 pirates. Looking back over the side, I watched them with great interest. One of them had various tools hanging from his belt, while the other was holding several pieces of scrap wood, seemingly there to make repairs to the ship's hull. The wooden surface of the Libertas, as Captain McFarley had called it, was rather splintered and broken up, and I could just barely see some small bullet holes scattered across. I only vaguely recalled the events of the attack on the oasis, but I did remember hearing gunshots and the sounds of cannons firing. I turned my gaze over my shoulder to take a brief stock of the rest of the ship. Unsurprisingly, it had sustained a fair amount of damage. There were tears in the sails, a few broken mizzenmasts, and some general debris laying around on deck, though the crew was hard at work cleaning it up. I leaned over the railing to take another look at the men making repairs. All that damage done, all the trouble and effort to repair it, and all they had to show for it was me, the only person on that entire ship whom they would be unable to ransom.
Not thinking of going for another swim, are you?
I stifled a gasp and whirled around. Grayson was moving purposefully towards me, shooting warning glares at a few crew members who were still staring. I couldn't keep the scowl from my face as he approached. I just needed some air, I muttered. Grayson let out a grunt, leaning forward and drumming his fingers against the wood.
Don't know if you've noticed, but you're drawing quite a lot of attention out here,
he informed me, casting another glance over his shoulder. I very much had noticed. Even though I was avoiding eye contact with the other pirates at all costs, I could still feel them staring holes in my back. I straightened my shoulders and pressed my lips together, trying to look like I was unbothered. Grayson opened his mouth to say something, but then his gaze was drawn to the 2 men suspended from the far side of the ship, and he suddenly leaned further over the railing.
Oi!
He shouted. The 2 pirates who I had just been watching had begun shoving at each other, and were now swaying back and forth against the hull.
Bloody fucking idiots!
Grayson yelled, taking a few steps closer to where they were hanging.
If one of you falls in, no one is coming to fish you out.
The pirates steadied themselves and looked up at Grayson. grumbling to themselves, but resuming their work. Grayson exhaled and shook his head with a measure of exasperation, muttering a swear under his breath.
Bloody hell.
I observed him for a moment, brow furrowing. Now that I was hearing him, alongside everyone else on deck, I couldn't help but mark a difference in his speech when compared to the rest of the crew. There was a cadence in his voice that didn't quite fit with the bits and pieces of conversation I could hear around me. Was it a suppressed accent? It was faint, of course, likely faded with time, but there were still traces of it. Just enough to make me raise an eyebrow, but not enough to place it. I was forced to quickly put my curiosity away as his attention returned to me. He threw another glance sideways before suddenly grabbing hold of my wrist.
I think that's quite enough fresh air,
he said, pulling me away from the railing. I was surprised enough to stumble, but recovered and managed to resist, trying to rip my arm away from him. "Let me go!" I protested, but with a swift yank he dragged me in close to him. The palm of his hand was rough and leathery, and I could feel hard calluses pressing against my skin as he tightened his grip. I found myself much nearer to him than I wanted to be, and had nowhere to look but into his stern grey eyes.
I meant what I said yesterday,
he said, voice low.
We'd all feel a lot better about this little arrangement if you kept yourself out of trouble and did as you were told.
His brow twitched.
Unless, that is, you prefer to have a bunch of slack-jawed pirates leering at you. If you keep walking around dressed as you are, it won't be long before one of them loses control.
Colour rushed to my cheeks, and I clenched my jaw, trying to extract myself from his clutches again, but he held tight.
Sooner or later,
he continued, softer still,
one of these men is going to rip that little dress off and have his way with you, and he's not going to care about what you have to say about it. Is that what you want?
Before I could stop myself, I raised my free hand and slapped Grayson hard across his left cheek. Everything above deck went dead. Several pairs of eyes turned to us, and I took a step back, feeling the sting on my hand, and fear once again rising in my throat. Grayson looked stunned for a moment, but slowly rotated his head back to face me. Now I've done it, I thought to myself. He's going to kill me. It felt as though eons were passing, as no one moved or said a word. Grayson's eyes met mine again, now burning, and I braced myself for him to strike me back, slit my throat, throw me overboard, or all of the above. Instead, however, he took a deliberate step towards me, leaning close to my ear. I tried not to flinch as his breath skittered across my cheek.
Don't say I didn't warn you,
he murmured. And with that, he whipped around and stalked off.